I booked the Airbnb late at night without thinking too much about it. I was driving through a smaller town for work and needed a place to sleep for 3 nights. The listing looked normal. A small detached house behind another property, clean photos, neutral furniture, nothing fancy. It said self-check-in with a keypad. That alone made it feel simple and safe. I parked on a narrow gravel driveway just after sunset, the kind that crunches loud under your tires and makes you feel exposed. The main house sat closer to the road, dark and quiet, and the Airbnb was farther back near a tree line. The air felt cold and damp. There was no wind, just that heavy stillness that makes every sound stand out. I unlocked the door with the code, stepped inside, and locked it behind me out of habit. The place smelled like cleaning spray mixed with old wood. Not dirty, just stale. The lights flickered when I turned them on, then settled. The layout was simple. A small living room, a narrow kitchen, a bathroom, and 1 bedroom at the back. The ceilings were low, and the house felt older than the photos showed. Every step made the floor creak in a different way. I did a quick check like I always do. Windows locked, bathroom door closed, bedroom door open. Nothing strange. I put my bag down and sat on the couch for a minute, listening. The fridge hummed. Pipes clicked somewhere in the walls. Normal house noises. I told myself I was tired and reading too much into it. That first night passed mostly fine. I slept light, waking up a few times because the house made sounds as it cooled. Around early morning, I woke up with the feeling that something had changed. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why my chest felt tight. I listened carefully. There was a soft sound, almost like fabric brushing against wood, coming from somewhere above the bedroom. It stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was the house settling and eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, everything looked the same. I made coffee, checked my phone, and left for work. When I came back that evening, I noticed something small that bothered me more than it should have. The front door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. I always lock doors. I stood there for a moment before going in, scanning the area. Nothing looked disturbed. Inside, my bag was where I left it. No drawers open, no lights on. I locked the door again and tried to shake the feeling. That night, the sounds came back, louder this time. Slow footsteps, not heavy, but careful, moving across the ceiling above the living room. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, counting the seconds. The sound stopped when I moved. I stayed awake for hours, listening, barely breathing. Nothing else happened, but sleep never really came. On the 3rd day, things felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. The air inside the house felt thicker, like it had been breathed too many times. I noticed faint scuff marks on the kitchen floor that hadn't been there before, leading toward the hallway. The bathroom mirror had a smudge near the edge, like someone had wiped it with a sleeve. I hadn't used it that morning. I checked my bag. Nothing missing. I decided to look around more carefully. I opened every cabinet, every closet. In the hallway ceiling, there was a small square panel I hadn't noticed before. An attic access. The edges were darker than the rest of the ceiling, like it had been opened recently. I pulled a chair under it and stood there for a long time, staring up, trying to convince myself not to touch it. Eventually, I pushed it up just enough to shine my phone light inside. The attic was low and unfinished. Wooden beams, insulation, dust everywhere. What made my stomach drop was the disturbed insulation directly above the bedroom. A narrow path pressed down, like someone had been crawling back and forth. I noticed a crushed water bottle and a dark shape farther back. I didn't climb up. I lowered the panel and stepped away, my hands shaking. I grabbed my bag and left immediately. I didn't sleep there again. I stayed at a motel near the highway and barely slept anyway. The next morning, I went back in daylight with a heavy sense of dread. The house looked harmless in the sun. Birds chirped. Cars passed on the road. I felt stupid for being scared, but I went inside anyway to get the rest of my things. The attic panel was slightly out of place, not fully closed. I didn't touch it this time. I took photos of everything I had noticed, the marks, the panel, the scuffs. I left and never went back inside. Later that day, I learned what had been happening. The property owner contacted me after I reported the issue through the app. Authorities were sent to the house. They found a man living in the attic crawl space. He had been entering through a loose vent behind the house and staying there between guests. He had food wrappers, bottles, and blankets hidden deep in the insulation. He had been watching guests through small gaps near the vents, learning their routines, moving only when they were asleep or gone. The realization hit me slowly and then all at once. Every sound, every unlocked door, every disturbed object suddenly made sense. He had been there while I slept. He had been inches above me, listening, waiting. The fear didn't fade when I checked out. Followed me home. The ending wasn't dramatic. No chase, no sudden moment of escape. It ended with reports, statements, and a quiet confirmation that I had been right to trust my instincts. The listing was removed. The owner sealed the attic and vents. The man was taken into custody. Even now, months later, I still lock doors twice. I still check ceilings in unfamiliar places. I don't stay in detached rentals anymore. That Airbnb taught me that the scariest situations don't come with warnings or obvious signs. Sometimes they are quiet, hidden, and waiting above you while you sleep, counting on you to never look up. I had booked an Airbnb in a small town on the outskirts of a city I didn't know well. I was there for work, and it was late October, the kind of cold where the air feels heavy and damp even inside a car. The listing looked normal. A small, single-story house set back from the road behind a high fence, with a narrow driveway leading to the front. Promised privacy, which was why I chose it, but I didn't realize how isolated it actually was until I arrived. By the time I pulled in, the sun had set, and the streetlights were few and far between. The house in front of me was dark, the windows reflecting the faint glow of my headlights, giving it a cold, almost lifeless look. I parked and took a deep breath, trying to shake off a creeping feeling that had settled in my chest. I approached the door, following the check-in instructions on the app. A keypad on the doorframe blinked, and I punched in the code. The lock clicked open. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me immediately. A mix of cleaning chemicals and a faint musty odor that reminded me of old basements. The house itself was smaller than the photo suggested, with a living room, kitchen, bathroom, and one bedroom. Everything looked clean, but the wood floors creaked under my weight, each one letting out a high, sharp groan as I walked across them. The house had low ceilings and narrow hallways, and the lights flickered briefly when I turned them on. I unpacked my bag slowly, my eyes scanning the room. The windows were all locked, but I ran my hand over each frame, just to be sure. I have a habit of checking places thoroughly, and this habit probably saved me from what came next. I set my bag on the small couch in the living room and sat down, trying to relax. The refrigerator hummed quietly. The pipes in the walls clicked and groaned as the house adjusted to the cooling night. I told myself these were normal house sounds, that my mind was being overly cautious. The first night was uneventful, mostly. I slept lightly, waking up every few hours at the sound of the house settling. Around 3 in the morning, I woke again. Something felt off. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint, dragging noise coming from somewhere near the kitchen. It was soft, careful, almost deliberate. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was probably a neighbor or the wind shifting something outside. I stayed still until the sound stopped, then eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The front door, which I was certain I had locked before bed, was unlocked. I froze for a moment, staring at it. I double-checked the lock and relocked it, but unease lingered. Inside, everything appeared normal. My bag was where I left it. Nothing else seemed disturbed. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe I had misremembered locking it. But the feeling in my gut didn't disappear. That day, while I was out running errands, I kept imagining what it would be like if someone had been inside the house while I slept. Every noise I thought I heard outside felt like footsteps. When I returned that evening, the feeling of being watched was stronger. I entered the house and went straight to the bedroom to check my things. My bag was untouched, but as I moved through the kitchen, I noticed something new. A faint smear on the counter, a dark mark that wasn't there before. The floors had scuffs that led toward the hallway. I started searching the house more carefully. Cabinets, closets, even under the couch cushions. That's when I saw it. A small ceiling panel in the hallway that I had never noticed. It was a square hatch leading to the attic. The edges were darker than the rest of the ceiling, like someone had touched it with dirty hands. My hands were shaking as I pulled a chair over and lifted the panel. The attic was low and narrow, the kind you could barely sit up in. Dust floated in the air, thick and choking. There were wooden beams and insulation, but the most alarming thing was the path pressed down in the insulation, leading from one end of the attic to the other. Someone had been crawling there. I didn't climb up. I didn't need to. The thought that someone had been living in that space, above me while I slept, made my blood run cold. I lowered the panel and backed away, heart pounding. I grabbed my bag and left immediately. I didn't spend another night there. I found a motel in the next town and barely slept at all. Every small noise made me jump. Every shadow outside the window felt alive. The next morning, I called the Airbnb host to explain what I had discovered. Authorities were sent to investigate. When they returned, they confirmed my worst fears. A man had been living in the attic crawl space, using a vent at the back of the house to enter and exit without being noticed. He had set up a small area with blankets and some food, hiding there while guests were away or asleep. He had left no obvious signs in the living areas, relying on the narrowness of the space and the house's normal creaks to cover his presence. The house was sealed off, the attic reinforced, and the man was taken into custody. The listing was removed from Airbnb. The host apologized and explained that they had no idea someone had been living in the attic. I never returned to that town for work again, and I haven't stayed in an isolated rental since. Even months later, the memory lingers. I check doors twice. I inspect windows. I look up at ceilings in every unfamiliar space I enter. The experience taught me something I can't unlearn. Danger doesn't always come with warning signs, and sometimes the most terrifying presence is the one you can't see. A house can feel empty and quiet, completely normal, but it can also hide someone, waiting, observing, crawling just above your head while you think you're alone. The fear isn't dramatic. It's the slow realization that you weren't as safe as you thought you were. That is the part that sticks with you. The part that makes every creak, every shadow, every flicker of light a potential threat. And no matter how many times I tell myself it's over, the memory makes my skin crawl the moment I step into a quiet, unfamiliar place again. The ending was not sudden or cinematic. It was calm, procedural, but its impact was total. The Airbnb no longer exists. The man is in custody. I am safe, but the lesson is permanent. Some risks are invisible, patient, and frighteningly ordinary. They don't announce themselves. They don't leave dramatic signs. They wait, and sometimes the only thing keeping you safe is your own attention to the smallest details. Locks, panels, scuffs, and the faintest hint that something is out of place. I learned that too late, but I survived, and now I never underestimate the quiet. This one experience reshaped how I travel. I double-check every lock, every window, every small corner of a space before I allow myself to relax. I look at ceilings differently. I approach quiet differently. The fear itself became a tool, a survival mechanism. And that's the reality I carry with me now. The world isn't always dramatic in its threats. Sometimes, the scariest things are hidden in plain sight, waiting for you to let your guard down. As ordinary and quiet as the house I almost didn't leave in time. I booked the Airbnb on a whim. I had a long drive ahead of me for work and wanted a place that felt private, somewhere I could crash without dealing with hotels. The listing was perfect, or so I thought. It was a small, single-story house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of a small town. The photos showed a cozy interior, a living room with a worn couch, a tiny kitchen with basic appliances, a single bedroom, and a bathroom with white tiles. The house looked clean and simple, and the price was reasonable. The reviews were mostly good, though a few mentioned odd noises at night, which I dismissed as creaky floors or neighbors. I arrived just as the sun was setting, the sky streaked with orange and purple. The streets were empty, and the few houses around were dark, their occupants tucked inside. The driveway was gravel, narrow, and framed by overgrown shrubs that brushed against my car as I drove in. The main house near the road was dark, and I felt a pang of isolation as I parked in front of the Airbnb. There was no streetlight nearby, just the faint glow from the distant road. I grabbed my bag and approached the door, following the self-check-in instructions on the app. The keypad blinked, and I entered the code. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. The first thing I noticed was the smell, a mixture of cleaning chemicals and something faintly musty, like damp wood or old upholstery. The house looked exactly like the photos, but somehow smaller. The ceilings were low, and the floors creaked with every step. I set my bag down in the living room and walked through each room, checking windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. Habit really, but it's a habit that has saved me before. The house seemed empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just nerves from driving all day. That first night, I slept lightly. I woke multiple times at the sound of the house settling. Pipes clicking, floorboards groaning. Around 2 a.m., I awoke to a faint noise, a soft scraping coming from the kitchen. It was quiet, deliberate, and deliberate noises in an empty house make your stomach twist. I lay still, listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds, but my heart didn't settle. I told myself it was the fridge, the wind, or a branch brushing against the house outside. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep again, though not comfortably. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. The front door was unlocked. I could have sworn I had locked it before bed. I froze, staring at it. I checked it again, then locked it firmly. Nothing inside seemed disturbed. My bag was untouched. The kitchen counters were as I had left them, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at me. I spent the day distracted, thinking about what could have happened. My mind wandered to scenarios I didn't want to imagine, and I realized the house felt wrong. When I returned that evening, the feeling of being observed intensified. Small details made me uneasy. A smear on the kitchen counter, faint scuff marks on the floor near the hallway, a chair slightly out of place that I hadn't moved. I ran my hands over everything, looking for signs of someone else, but found nothing definitive. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been in the house. On the third day, I decided to inspect the house more thoroughly. I opened every cabinet and closet, looking for anything out of place. That's when I noticed a small panel in the hallway ceiling that I hadn't seen before. It was a square hatch leading to an attic crawl space. The edges were darker, like someone had handled it recently. My hands shook as I placed a chair underneath and pushed the panel up just enough to shine my phone light inside. The attic was low and narrow, with wooden beams and insulation everywhere. The smell was sharp, like old wood mixed with dust and faintly sour air. My heart stopped when I noticed a pressed path through the insulation, running from one end of the attic to the other. Someone had been crawling there. I didn't climb up. I didn't need to. The thought of someone hiding above me, moving while I slept, was enough to make me back away. I packed my bag immediately and left. I didn't sleep there again. I checked into a motel in the next town, but sleep didn't come easily. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed alive. My mind replayed every creak, every small noise from the previous nights. The following morning, I called the Airbnb host and reported what I had found. Authorities came to the house later that day. They confirmed that a man had been living in the attic crawl space, entering through a vent behind the house. He had blankets, a few food wrappers, and basic supplies hidden deep in the insulation. He had been careful, coming down only when guests were out or asleep, watching quietly and avoiding detection. The house itself gave no obvious signs of intrusion, which explained why I hadn't seen anything initially. The host apologized, shocked and embarrassed, explaining that they had no idea someone was living in the attic. The man was taken into custody, and the attic was sealed off. The Airbnb listing was removed from the platform, and I never returned to that town. The ending wasn't dramatic. No chase, no sudden confrontation. It was quiet, procedural, but the impact was total. I survived, but it changed how I travel. I check doors twice, inspect windows, and now I always look up at ceilings in unfamiliar spaces. That Airbnb taught me a lesson I will never forget. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's quiet, hidden, waiting above you while you sleep, counting on your ignorance. The fear wasn't cinematic. It was slow, creeping, and persistent. A constant reminder that even ordinary, everyday places can hide threats. Months later, the memory still lingers. Every time I step into a quiet, unfamiliar space, my senses sharpen. I notice small details others might overlook. Scuff marks, smudges, small panels, anything that seems out of place. It's exhausting at times, but I've learned that the scariest situations are often invisible, patient, and frighteningly ordinary. The house could have seemed safe, could have seemed normal, but it wasn't. Someone had been there, and they were careful, unnoticed. That realization is a weight I carry with me every time I travel. That's the reality of the experience. It didn't end with fireworks or sudden violence. It ended with reports, police intervention, and the slow relief that comes from knowing you survived something most people can't even imagine. The house was shut down. The man was in custody. I was safe, but the lesson remained. Trust your instincts, pay attention to small details, and never assume a quiet house is empty. Sometimes, the most ordinary places hide the most extraordinary danger, and survival depends on noticing the things others overlook. Even now, I can't forget it. Every creak, every draft, every faint shift of light in a room sends my mind racing. That Airbnb, which had seemed like a simple, harmless place to stay, turned into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It was the quiet, patient presence above me while I slept that made it unforgettable. I survived because I noticed the little things, and I carry that lesson with me every time I step into an unfamiliar house. Safety, I learned, isn't about luck. It's about awareness, attention, and the willingness to act when something feels wrong. The memory is clear, detailed, and permanent. The fear was real, tangible, and fully justified. And now, every time I stay somewhere new, I check ceilings, locks, and corners. I look for panels, vents, and anything that could hide a presence. I remain vigilant, not paranoid, but aware. That experience changed the way I think about staying in any isolated space. It changed the way I trust photos, listings, and descriptions. And it left me with a simple, unshakable truth. Some of the scariest things in life are ordinary, silent, and waiting where you least expect them. I had been planning this trip for weeks. Work was relentless, and my apartment felt like a cage, so I decided to escape for a few days. I found an Airbnb in a small rural town, about a 2-hour drive from the city. The listing was simple: a standalone house on the edge of farmland, surrounded by trees. Nothing fancy, nothing modern, just a quiet place where I could be alone. The reviews were short but positive, saying things like, "Peaceful and quiet getaway." That's exactly what I wanted. The drive was uneventful at first, the kind of calm that makes you feel safe. But as I left the highway, the road narrowed, the asphalt cracking into potholes, and eventually it turned to gravel. My tires crunched loudly against the stones, and the silence around me felt too complete. There were no streetlights, no houses close by, not even farm animals. The GPS signal faded, leaving only a blank map, but I had the address printed, so I continued. When I arrived, the house was almost hidden by overgrown trees and tall weeds. It was a single-story structure, with siding gray and peeling in places, with a small porch that looked like it hadn't been swept in months. The front windows were dark, reflecting the late afternoon light back at me. There were no cars, no signs of anyone, and even the air smelled different. Damp, earthy, almost metallic. It felt isolated in a way I hadn't fully realized until I stepped out of the car. Inside, the house was cooler than expected, and the air smelled faintly of dust and wood polish. The floors creaked under my steps, and I noticed cobwebs in corners that the photos hadn't shown. The kitchen was small, functional, clean but bare. The bathroom was spotless, probably scrubbed for the last guest. The bedroom had a simple bed, a dresser, and curtains that blocked most of the light. I dropped my bag on the bed and slowly walked through every room. One room, a second bedroom, had a locked door. I assumed it was storage. Nothing about it worried me yet. I unpacked some groceries and made a simple dinner. The house felt quiet in a way that pressed against my ears. Outside, there were no cars, no dogs, not even wind. Just silence. After eating, I cleaned up, then decided to walk the perimeter of the house. The backyard was overgrown, full of weeds and trees that pressed close to the walls. I didn't see any footprints, tire tracks, or signs of recent activity. The air was damp, and my shoes sank slightly into the soft earth. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't expected, even though the house seemed secure. That night, I tried to sleep early. The quiet made it harder than usual. Every creak of the house sounded deliberate. I thought I heard footsteps outside the bedroom door, but dismissed them as imagination. The darkness in the room felt heavy, almost alive, pressing down from the ceiling and walls. I left a small light on, trying to maintain some sense of control. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A slow, deliberate scrape from the hallway outside the bedroom. My first thought was that the house was settling. I sat up and listened, heart racing. The sound stopped, then moved again, this time closer to the bedroom. It was heavy, purposeful. Someone, or something, was moving around outside my door. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal. Maybe the wind catching something loose outside. But it didn't feel right. It moved too carefully, and it came from inside the house. I stood up slowly, trying not to make noise. The hallway outside was dark, but the floorboards glimmered faintly under the moonlight through the window. Another scrape. Closer. Panic rose. I remembered the locked bedroom. Could someone be inside it? I crept toward the door and tried the handle. Locked. My mind raced. I didn't want to go to the back door because it was far, and running through the dark hallway felt impossible. I grabbed my phone and tried to call, but no signal. I sat on the floor, back against the bed, gripping my phone, listening. The house had never sounded so large and empty at the same time. The sounds continued intermittently, moving through the house. Sometimes it was above, from the ceiling. Sometimes it was outside the bedroom. I realized the attic might be the source. The house had a small pull-down attic hatch in the hallway ceiling. I hadn't noticed before. I stared at it, a knot of fear tightening in my chest. I didn't know if anyone was up there now, or if they had left. But the idea that someone could be hiding above me made the room feel smaller. Morning came slowly. The gray light through the curtains made everything feel less oppressive, but it didn't erase the fear. I walked through the house, checking every window and door. Everything was closed, nothing disturbed, except for the attic hatch. It looked slightly off-center, as if it had been pushed or moved recently. Dust on the floor below the vent seemed fresh, as if scraped from above. I moved a chair under the hatch and stood on it. Inside the attic, the air was stale, thick with the smell of insulation and dust. There were flattened areas, signs someone had been lying there. Empty water bottles, food wrappers, and a rolled-up thin mattress pad in a corner. Someone had been living there. Someone could have watched me while I slept. I didn't climb in, but the proof was enough. I packed my things quickly, checking every corner twice before I left. My hands shook so badly I had to grip the steering wheel tight to drive. I didn't stop until the city lights came into view and my phone reconnected. I reported everything to the Airbnb platform and local authorities. They said cases like this happen more than people realize. Places that sit empty for days or weeks are easy for people to enter and hide. The ending was simple. I never stayed in that town again, and I stopped booking isolated properties, no matter how cheap or quiet they promised to be. What stayed with me was the memory of that night, the weight of silence, the sound of deliberate movement, the realization that someone had been in the same house as me without my knowledge. The fear didn't come from anything supernatural. It came from the very real vulnerability of being alone in a space that seemed safe but wasn't. The lesson was clear. Isolation is dangerous, and quiet can hide more than just peace. Even weeks later, when I think about that house, I can feel the weight of that quiet pressing down, reminding me that sometimes the scariest things are just people and empty spaces, and the worst part is how normal it all looks until it isn't. I never looked back. Every time I hear a strange creak in my apartment now, I check it twice. I lock every door, even the inside ones, and I always book places that are populated or at least visible from the road. That house taught me that fear doesn't need ghosts, just space, silence, and the unknown. The memory of it will never leave, and I don't want it to. It changed how I see every quiet, empty house. I know now that safety is never guaranteed, no matter what the photos promise. I had been driving for almost 12 hours straight, and by the time I reached the small town where my Airbnb was located, the sun had completely disappeared behind the horizon. The streetlights were few and far between, flickering intermittently, and the road leading to the property was lined with dense trees that cast heavy shadows on the asphalt. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly, feeling my exhaustion weigh down every thought, but I was glad I had booked a private house instead of a motel. I just wanted somewhere quiet to crash for the next 3 nights. The listing had seemed perfect. A small, detached house with a tiny porch, nestled behind another building, with a gravel driveway that extended about 50 feet from the main road. The photos on the app made it look cozy. A living room with a soft couch, a small kitchen with clean counters, a single bedroom with a queen bed, and a modest bathroom. The host advertised it as quiet and private, and that's exactly what I needed. I parked on the gravel, feeling it crunch under my tires, and noticed immediately how isolated the house was. The neighboring houses were dark and set back from the street. Nothing moved. It was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I got out of the car and carried my bag to the front door. The self-check-in instructions had me use a keypad. I entered the code, and the door clicked open. The smell hit me first. A mix of cleaning chemicals and something faintly damp, like wet wood. It wasn't unpleasant, but it wasn't neutral either. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. The floors creaked as I walked, each step making a soft, high-pitched groan. The house looked exactly like the photos, but in person, it felt smaller and more cramped. The ceilings were low, the hallways narrow, and the walls seemed to close in slightly. I unpacked my bag slowly, running my hands over the windows and doors to make sure they were all secure. The refrigerator hummed quietly, and the pipes in the walls clicked occasionally. I told myself these were normal sounds and tried to relax. I made a cup of coffee in the small kitchen and sat on the couch for a few minutes, just listening. First, everything seemed fine. The house was quiet, normal, ordinary. But the moment I stopped moving, I felt a faint tension, a sense that something was off. The first night passed mostly uneventfully. I slept lightly, waking a few times at the sound of the house settling. Around 2 in the morning, I woke with my heart pounding. There was a faint noise, soft and deliberate, coming from somewhere near the kitchen. It sounded like someone dragging a bag or shifting furniture slowly, carefully. I stayed still, listening. The noise stopped after a few seconds. I tried to convince myself it was the fridge or a tree branch brushing against the house. Sleep eventually came, but it was shallow and fitful. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The front door was unlocked. I had been certain I locked it before going to bed. I froze for a moment, staring at it. I checked the lock and secured it again, my hands shaking slightly. Nothing inside seemed disturbed. My bag was untouched. The counters were clean. The bed was as I had left it, but the feeling remained, gnawing at me. I tried to go about my day as usual, but I couldn't shake the sense of unease. Later that day, while out running errands, I kept imagining someone in the house. Every little sound I thought I heard outside the car made my stomach twist. When I returned that evening, I noticed more small signs. Faint scuff marks on the kitchen floor leading toward the hallway, a small smear on the bathroom mirror, a chair slightly out of place. Everything was subtle, nothing alarming on its own, but together it painted a picture I didn't want to imagine. I checked the house thoroughly, opening cabinets and closets, but found nothing. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been moving around while I wasn't looking. On the third day, I decided to investigate the house more carefully. That's when I noticed a small square panel in the hallway ceiling. I had never seen it before. It was slightly discolored along the edges, the paint worn, as if it had been handled recently. My heart started to pound. I pulled a chair under it and lifted the panel just enough to shine my phone light inside. The attic crawl space was narrow, dusty, and filled with wooden beams and insulation. My stomach dropped when I noticed a flattened path through the insulation, as though someone had been crawling back and forth. There was a small, crumpled water bottle and a dark shape farther back. I didn't climb up. I didn't need to. I knew immediately what it meant. Someone had been living in that attic space, entering the house when guests were away or asleep. I backed away, heart racing, and packed my bag. I left immediately, not daring to spend another night there. I drove to a nearby motel and barely slept at all, every little sound keeping me on edge. The next morning, I called the Airbnb host and explained what I had found. Authorities came to inspect the property. They confirmed my fears. A man had been living in the attic, using a vent at the back of the house to enter and exit without being seen. He had blankets, food wrappers, and other basic supplies hidden in the insulation. He had been careful, moving only when guests were away or asleep, watching quietly and avoiding detection. The house itself showed no obvious signs of intrusion, which explained why I hadn't noticed anything at first. The host was shocked and apologized repeatedly. The man was taken into custody, the attic was sealed off, and the Airbnb listing was permanently removed from the platform. I never returned to that town for work. The ending wasn't dramatic or cinematic. There was no confrontation, no chase. The danger was gone, but the lesson stayed with me. I survived, but it changed how I travel forever. Even months later, the memory haunts me. I check doors twice, inspect windows, and always look up at ceilings in unfamiliar spaces. I notice small details others might overlook. Scuffs, smudges, panels, vents, anything out of place. It's exhausting sometimes, but necessary. That experience taught me that the scariest threats are often invisible, patient, and frighteningly ordinary. A house can seem completely normal, safe, and quiet, yet hide a presence that is silent, waiting, and observing. The Airbnb changed my perception of safety. I now travel with vigilance, never assuming a space is empty just because it appears so. That quiet, isolated house taught me a lesson I will never forget. Danger doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't need to. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is someone hiding in plain sight, waiting for you to let your guard down. And sometimes, the only thing keeping you safe is noticing the smallest, most subtle signs that something is off, and having the presence of mind to act before it's too late. I survived because I paid attention. I survived because I trusted the feeling in my gut. The experience didn't end with a dramatic confrontation, but it ended with clarity. I was safe, the intruder was caught, and the house was secured. But the lesson remains permanent. Every creak, every shadow, every minor disturbance in a quiet place reminds me of that house, that attic, that path through the insulation. It changed how I see the world and how I approach unfamiliar spaces. And it left me with one simple, unshakable truth. Ordinary places can hide extraordinary danger, and the cost of ignoring the signs can be terrifying. Even now, every time I step into a quiet house I've never seen before, I look up. I check locks twice. I notice small scuffs and smudges. I scan ceilings, vents, and panels. I am hyper-aware, not paranoid, but vigilant. That Airbnb taught me that safety isn't something you assume. It's something you actively maintain. And I carry that lesson with me everywhere I go. Every time I stay somewhere new, every time I hear a creak in the night. Because some dangers are quiet, patient, and ordinary. And sometimes, the only thing standing between you and disaster is your own awareness. I had booked the Airbnb somewhat impulsively. It was late November, and I had a long drive ahead to attend a short work conference in a town I had never visited. I wanted somewhere private, somewhere that felt more like a home than a hotel. The listing seemed ideal. A small, detached house tucked behind another property, with a narrow driveway, a fenced backyard, and a small porch. The photos made it look cozy, neutral colors, clean floors, a soft couch, and a simple bedroom. Reviews were mostly positive, although a few mentioned creaky floors and weird noises at night. I ignored those, assuming they were just the normal sounds of an older house. I arrived just as dusk was falling. The sky was a dull gray, and the street was almost completely deserted. Sparse streetlights flickered in the distance, but they didn't reach the driveway. The main house closer to the road was dark and silent, and the Airbnb was set back behind it, partially hidden by trees. As I drove up the gravel driveway, it crunched loudly under my tires, echoing in the still air. The closer I got, the more isolated it felt. My stomach had that low, uneasy twist that comes when you realize how far you are from anyone else. I grabbed my bag and walked to the front door, following the check-in instructions on the app. A keypad blinked faintly in the dim light. I punched in the code, and the lock clicked open. The smell hit me as soon as I stepped inside. A combination of cleaning spray and a faint musty scent, like damp wood or old carpeting. Not unpleasant, but it made me pause for a moment. I locked the door behind me out of habit and started to take in the space. The house was smaller than the photos suggested. The ceilings were low, the hallway narrow, and the rooms cramped. The living room had a couch and a small coffee table. The kitchen had basic appliances. The bedroom had a queen-sized bed, and the bathroom was clean but simple. Every step I took made the floors creak. I walked slowly through the rooms, checking windows and doors, running my hands along frames and locks. The refrigerator hummed softly. Pipes clicked occasionally. The house felt empty, but there was a tension in the air I couldn't shake. I unpacked my bag and sat on the couch for a few minutes, just listening. The silence was heavy. Outside, the trees barely moved, but every faint rustle sounded amplified. I told myself I was tired, that my imagination was running wild. I made coffee in the tiny kitchen and tried to settle in. The first night passed mostly without incident, though I woke several times, startled by normal house sounds. The creak of a floorboard, the tap of a pipe. Around 3 in the morning, I woke again, my heart racing. I thought I heard a soft scraping noise coming from the kitchen. It was deliberate and quiet, but unmistakable. I froze, listening. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I told myself it was a branch brushing the house or maybe something falling outside. Sleep came reluctantly. The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The front door, which I had locked the night before, was unlocked. I froze for a moment, staring at it. I double-checked the lock and secured it again. Nothing else seemed disturbed. My bag was untouched. The counters and appliances were exactly where I left them. But the unease didn't fade. I spent the day distracted, thinking about what could have happened while I slept. Every small noise outside made me jump. That evening, when I returned, the house felt different. I noticed small details that hadn't been there before. Faint scuff marks on the floor near the hallway, a smudge on the bathroom mirror, and a chair slightly out of place. I checked my bag, ensuring nothing was missing. I walked through every room, opening cabinets and closets, but found nothing unusual. Yet, a deep sense of being watched gnawed at me. The thought of someone having been in the house while I slept made my chest tighten. On the third day, I decided to inspect the house more thoroughly. That's when I noticed a small square panel in the hallway ceiling. I hadn't seen it before. The edges were slightly discolored, as if it had been handled recently. My hands trembled as I placed a chair underneath and lifted the panel just enough to shine my phone light inside. The attic crawl space was low and narrow, dusty, with wooden beams and insulation. My stomach sank when I noticed a flattened path through the insulation running the length of the space. There was a crumpled water bottle and a dark object farther back. I didn't climb up. I didn't need to. I knew immediately what it meant. Someone had been living in that attic space, entering through a vent at the back of the house. They had moved around carefully, avoiding detection, coming down only when guests were asleep or away. I backed away, heart pounding, and packed my bag immediately. I left the house without sleeping another night, driving to a nearby motel and barely resting. Every small sound in the room made me jump. Every shadow seemed alive. The following morning, I called the Airbnb host and reported what I had found. Authorities were sent to the property to inspect it. They confirmed what I feared. A man had been living in the attic crawl space, using a vent at the back of the house to enter and exit unnoticed. He had blankets, food wrappers, and other basic supplies hidden in the insulation. He had been careful, moving only when guests were gone or asleep. The house showed no obvious signs of intrusion, which explained why I hadn't noticed anything sooner. The host was shocked and apologized repeatedly. The man was taken into custody. The attic was sealed off, and the Airbnb listing was removed from the platform. I never returned to that town for work. The danger was gone, but the lesson remained. Months later, the memory still lingers. I check doors twice, inspect windows, and always look up at ceilings in unfamiliar spaces. I notice small details others might overlook. Scuff marks, smudges, small panels, vents, anything out of place. It's exhausting at times, but necessary. That experience taught me that the scariest threats are often invisible, patient, and frighteningly ordinary. A house can seem completely normal, safe, and quiet, yet hide a presence that is silent, waiting, and observing. The Airbnb changed how I perceive safety. I now travel with vigilance, never assuming a space is empty just because it appears so. That quiet, isolated house taught me a lesson I will never forget. Danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes the most terrifying thing is someone hiding in plain sight, waiting for you to let your guard down. I survived because I paid attention. I survived because I trusted the feeling in my gut. The experience didn't end with a dramatic confrontation, but it ended with clarity. I was safe, the intruder was caught, and the house was secured. But the lesson is permanent. Every creak, every shadow, every minor disturbance in a quiet place reminds me of that house, that attic, that path through the insulation. It changed how I see the world and how I approach unfamiliar spaces. Now, whenever I step into a quiet house I've never seen before, I look up. I check locks twice. I scan ceilings, vents, and panels. I am hyper-aware, not paranoid, but vigilant. That Airbnb taught me that safety isn't something you assume. It's something you actively maintain. And I carry that lesson with me everywhere I go, every time I stay somewhere new, every time I hear a creak in the night. Because some dangers are quiet, patient, and ordinary. Sometimes the only thing standing between you and disaster is your own awareness, and that realization is something I will never forget. I run a small Airbnb near a lake, the kind of place people book because the pictures look calm and clean and far away from trouble. Trees around the house, water down the slope, a narrow road that only the neighbors use. I always thought of it as quiet in a deep way, not just empty but settled. The house is older but solid. Big picture window facing the yard. Creek behind it, lake a short walk downhill. When guests are there, I usually feel relaxed because nothing ever happens. That idea got stripped away piece by piece over one long stretch of time that still feels sharp in my memory. The first strange thing happened on a bright afternoon when the guests were out for the day. They had gone hiking early. I know because I checked the exterior camera like I always do, just to make sure they left safely and didn't forget the door. I was at my other job when my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I expected a deer or maybe a delivery truck turning around. Instead, I saw the front of the house and something sudden and wrong. The picture window was shattered inward, glass everywhere, sunlight hitting the floor at a weird angle. A rock sat right in the middle of the living room rug like it had been placed there. I drove out later and walked through the house slowly, careful not to step on the glass. The rock was heavy, smooth, almost pretty in a way. It wasn't the kind you find in the creek behind the house. Those are small and rough. This one was bigger, rounded, pale gray with darker streaks. I recognized it as the kind that comes from the lake shore, where people skip stones. Someone had carried it uphill, across the yard, and thrown it with enough force to punch through thick glass. Nothing else was disturbed. No footprints I could see. No damage anywhere else. It didn't feel threatening in a clear way. It felt pointless and strange, like an impulse acted on without thinking about the mess it would leave behind. I cleaned it up, replaced the window, and told myself it was probably a bored teenager or someone drunk with bad ideas. I didn't tell the guests until they got back, and even then I kept it simple. They were understanding. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. The second incident was worse, heavier, and it happened when the guests were still there, or at least close enough that it mattered. My partner had gone by the house earlier that day to drop off clean towels and check on a slow drain. It was a routine visit. They left in a hurry because of rain coming in, and later we realized the back door had not been secured properly. It wasn't wide open, but it wasn't locked either. At the time, we didn't know that mistake was about to turn into a problem. I got a notification from the camera again, late afternoon. A figure moving around the back of the house, not like a guest, not like a neighbor. The movement was fast and loose, jittery. The person went straight to the back door and slipped inside. My stomach dropped in that slow, sinking way where your body understands danger before your mind catches up. I grabbed my keys and drove out there as fast as I could without losing control of the car. When I pulled into the driveway, the guests were just arriving back from their day. Their car was still idling. I didn't park. I left my door open and went straight toward the house. I could smell something before I even got inside. Burnt meat, chemical, hot wax. The house felt wrong the second I stepped through the door. The air was thick and uneven, like it had been stirred too much. In the kitchen, on the counter, sat a small bag that I didn't need to touch to know what it was. Next to it was my cutting board, dirty. In the main room, nothing looked stolen, but the order was off. A chair pulled out. A drawer half open. In the back bedroom, the candle we keep for guests was lit, flame steady, wax pooling down the side. It should never have been lit without someone staying there. The smell of it mixed with the burnt meat made my head feel tight. That was when I saw the cast iron pan on the stove. My cast iron. An old one that had belonged to my family for decades. It was blackened, seasoned perfectly from years of use. Inside it was a thin, overcooked steak, the cheapest cut you can buy, gray and curling at the edges. Grease spattered the stove. The sight of that pan being used like that, by someone who didn't belong there, set off a kind of anger that pushed past fear for a moment. The person came out of the hallway then, moving fast, eyes wild, body tense. Everything happened quickly after that, but my memory of it is sharp, like it was burned in. I moved back toward the door. My hand was already on my phone. The guests were still in the driveway, watching, unsure. I didn't want them inside. I didn't want them anywhere near what was happening. Law enforcement arrived fast, faster than I expected. The person bolted out the back door as soon as they realized what was happening. What followed felt unreal, like a scene I was watching instead of living. I ran after them without thinking, feet slipping on wet ground, heart pounding in my ears. One officer ran past me, faster, more focused. Another cut around ahead. The chase didn't last long. The person was caught hard, stopped suddenly. Their forward motion ended by a clean, brutal move that dropped them flat. I stopped running and stood there, bent over, trying to breathe. The adrenaline shook through me in waves. I watched as they were restrained and taken away. The house behind me felt exposed, like its skin had been peeled back. After it was over, I walked back inside slowly. The steak was still smoking faintly. The candle was still lit. I blew it out with a shaking hand. I turned off the stove. I opened windows even though it was raining. The guests never came inside. I told them they didn't need to. I comped their entire stay without hesitation. Money felt meaningless compared to the look on their faces and the fact that they had almost walked into something far worse. That night, after everyone left and the house was quiet again, I sat on the floor and cleaned. I washed the cast iron carefully, reseasoned it, like I was trying to undo what had happened. I wiped down every surface. I took out the trash twice. I checked every lock 3 times. I stood in front of the picture window, now repaired, and looked out into the dark yard. The lake was invisible, but I knew it was there. The same place the rock had come from. The same place people wandered during the day, skipping stones, not thinking about consequences. In the days that followed, the reality of it all settled in. The house didn't feel the same. I added more locks, better cameras, brighter lights. I stopped assuming quiet meant safe. I replayed every detail in my head, every small decision that had lined up just right for something bad to almost happen. A week later, the guests left their review. 5 stars. They wrote about how we handled the situation, how safe they felt afterward, how responsive we were. Reading it gave me a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that they weren't hurt. Sadness that this kind of thing had become part of the story of a place that was supposed to be simple and peaceful. Now, when I stand in that house, I still see it the way it was meant to be. Clean, quiet, calm. But I also see the rock on the rug, the candle flame in the back bedroom, the cheap steak ruining something that mattered to me. I know how fast things can change. The ending of this story is clear to me now. Everyone walked away alive. The guests were safe. The house still stands. But the illusion that nothing bad happens in quiet places is gone for good. And it is not coming back.